Alright, this vid's gonna be on sort of tuning your gas blowback. Um, there are a lot of things that if you tune will affect other things. There's a lot of mixed relationships between a lot of different aspects of your gas blowback that if you want to change one will most likely affect another aspect negatively or positively. So let's get into it. So, first thing, a lot of new gas blowback players and even people like me, like that, I've been using gas blowbacks for a while, still really want is lots of recoil. It's one of the main reasons why we get into gas blowbacks is because of the recoil. But you have to realize that if you go beyond the stock recoil of your gun, you end up negatively affecting not only your rate of fire, but you also affect gas efficiency. And there's a lot of ways to increase recoil. A lot of people like to do is get those angry recoil kits, which is usually a mix of like a lighter buffer spring with a heavier buffer. That way the whole buffer and bolt move faster, and there's more weight moving, causing a bigger impact at the end of travel, giving you more felt recoil. Sometimes just putting a lighter, just putting a heavier buffer in will do that, or just putting a lighter recoil buffer spring in will do that. Note, this doesn't just apply to M4 type gas blowbacks. It can be applied to almost any gas blowback rifle, or pistol, or submachine gun, or whatever. Anything with recoil that's gas operated, all these variables that you change will have the same effect on each platform to a certain degree. Another way you can up recoil is get a heavier bolt, or add weight to your bolt. Some bolts have a hollow back end, you can add weight inside of there, or you can get a steel bolt versus an aluminum bolt. GHK came with a steel bolt, a heavier buffer, and a weaker buffer spring. So that made the gun recoil really damn hard compared to a stock GMP walk. They kick, just not as hard because they have an aluminum bolt. They have a really light, I'm pretty sure, aluminum buffer, and they have a heavier buffer spring to make it cycle faster. And that's another thing. When you get into heavier recoil, most of the time you lose the snappiness or the rate of fire. Because remember, rate of fire doesn't just apply to full auto, but that rate of fire does also equivalent to how fast your bolt cycles on semi. So how fast you can spam the trigger. So if you really want a snappy semi-auto, like lots of people with Glock builds or high Kappa builds, they have a really fast cycle rate because their slides are super light and their buffer or their recoil springs are super heavy or stiff. So that way that light slide moves really fast back forward. But that also comes at a cost of gas efficiency. Because remember, if you have a heavier buffer spring, or heavier bolts, or heavier buffer, that mass is all pushing against the forces of the gas trying to push everything back. So there's lots of variables that you can go through that will affect everything. So I'm just gonna run through a bunch of scenarios and we'll take it from there. So I'll move this out the way for now, since we only need to really demonstrate or go through these hypotheticals. So how I have this set up is I do want heavy recoil and I do want a very snappy rate of fire. And pretty much the way you can do that is, like, I already have a steel bolt and a heavy buffer. All I needed was a stiffer buffer spring, which I got from my GMP. The reason why this came with a lighter buffer spring was because to keep gas efficiency at a certain point where it was still a usable rifle or had really good gas efficiency per shot, since you already have a steel bolt and a heavy buffer, which gives you really good recoil, they had to sacrifice, I guess, snappiness, or how snappy the trigger, or not how snappy the trigger is, but how snappy the cycle rate is. So they put a little bit of a lighter buffer spring, so that way this whole mass moves a bit faster. Even though it's heavy, it moves faster than compared to if it had a stiffer one, which it does now. So this one's really, it's not really stiff, but it's a lot stiffer. Whereas if you look at the GMP, which has light bolt, light buffer, and a light buffer spring, you might not really notice it that much. For me, because I've been doing this for a long time, I notice these things really well. But this just, one, doesn't when the bolt moves forward and snaps into batter, I guess you can call it, you don't have much of a forward thunk. Not only that, is if you can tell, that bolt's not moving as fast as this one. Now the reason why they had a stiffer buffer spring on a GHK in a stock configuration is because if you put a lighter buffer spring like you do in there, you really sacrifice how fast it cycles. You already have a lightweight buffer and a lightweight bolt, which means you don't have much mass moving forward. So it can still be pretty snappy, not very sluggish. But since it's so light, they put a stiffer buffer spring to help with that cycling. It's all physics and objects moving and blah blah blah. So back to this, since I have a heavy bolt, a heavy buffer, and a heavy buffer spring, it's like, okay, you have snappy and you have heavy recoil. That doesn't sound bad. Let me get to the bad part. Gas efficiency. Because now I have a heavier object to move, coupled with a stiffer spring to compress, I'm now having to use a little bit more gas per shot to get that bolt and everything to cycle, or to start moving and get that momentum to cycle. So there are trade-offs. I run CO2 mags, so I don't have much of a cooldown effect, and so I'm not too worried about gas efficiency. I'm just still toying with this. It's still relatively new to me, though, not just this platform, but this gun itself. So I'm still toying around, tuning it. But that's probably the one downside right now, is that the gas efficiency is a little bit lower. Now, if I wanted some better gas efficiency, I could get rid of the heavy buffer, put a lightweight one in, or I can go back to using the stock spring. I'll have to work these issues out the more I play with this gun. Now, let's say, hey, I'm not really a huge fan of recoil. The little recoil I'll get out of it is more than enough for over AEG or whatever. I just want a gun that cycles super fast and has great gas efficiency. To be honest, I wouldn't start with the GHK because you got a steel bolt, but let's say, for instance, you do want to. Actually, let's bring the GMP back, because this would probably be a better build for really fast cycle rate gun, because you have the lightweight bolt and you have the lightweight buffer. What you can do to get good gas efficiency and height rate of fire is you can short stroke it, just like you do with a pistol or a high cap or whatever. In the buffer tube, in America, a quarter, 25-cent coin, fits perfectly in this buffer tube. And you can stack these up so your bolt only cycles enough to cock the system and chamber a new round and all that. Personally, that's not my style, because at the end of the day, you will lose bolt catch function, because your bolt won't move back far enough to lock back. Just like the Glock or high kappa build, a lot of these people, they don't have slide catch anymore because they short stroked it so much. So that's one way you can get really good gas efficiency, because you're not losing that much gas, and two, your cycle rate's going to be wicked. I haven't even tried it. I might try it for fun sometime, but you can do that. Let's say you still want your bolt catch, which is usually the scenario I run because I always like having bolt catch. How do I make a very fast, gas efficient build? You're gonna have to get a stiffer buffer spring. It sucks because that will cause a little bit more gas usage, but the thing is, it will cycle a lot faster. Just like pistol builds, you get a higher percentage spring because you want that slide or bolt to go back home as quick as possible. You won't lose as much gas efficiency with a stiffer spring versus a heavier buffer and a heavier bolt. I don't know if you can go much lighter. You can. There's certain parts of the bolt, which I can show you now, that you can drill out to make it a lot lighter. So everything behind these arms, you can drill holes in. I wouldn't recommend drilling holes in these arms right here because they're very thin pieces of metal. Not thin, but they're thinner than the rest of the body. But back here, that's why they have these cutouts right here. Those aren't on a regular AR bolt or M4, M16 bolt. Those are there because they want to lose some weight. What you can do is just drill these out. Just start drilling holes in here and taking away this metal. And what you can also do is, if you want, you can find a plastic buffer. They have those. These come with like an aluminum lightweight buffer. But if you want even lighter, you could get a plastic buffer. I haven't really tried those, but you can try them. That's ways to get it more snappy. You lighten the bolt as much as you can, or lighten the mass that's moving, which is the buffer and the bolt. Lighten that as much as you can and stiffen up the spring more. You might not even have to stiffen the spring more because if you lighten the bolt enough, it's going to move a lot faster. Be warned, if you make your bolt light and have it move really fast, you can have bolt bounce, which is a thing in the real world too, where the bolt, if you look at it in slow motion, will come forward and move so fast it hits and moves back a little bit, so it bounces back. I had that with an issue on an old GMP rifle I had. There was some bolt bounce. It causes double jams because sometimes the bolt will move back far enough to semi-push a new BB out of the mag, and you'll either be shooting two BBs at once or it will jam the bolt up because the BB just blocks the nozzle. So you gotta watch out for that. Let's see. It pretty much covered most of it. That's basically how you tune most of your rifles, for how they like cycle and recoil, you know, or how good the gas efficiency is. If you want to go in terms of accuracy and FPS, we'll get into that right now. So with gas blowbacks, the length of your inner barrel and how tight it is seems to have more effect on your FPS than it does with like an AEG. I'm not saying it doesn't have an effect on AEGs, it does, but I think with gas blowbacks you see more of that effect. So obviously if you have a longer, tighter barrel, you're gonna have a jump in FPS because you're just getting a better seal and it's longer, so there's, just like a real gun, there's more time for that gas to expand behind the BB before it exits the barrel. So let's say if you have a super long gun and it's shooting way too hot. If I don't really believe in wide bores, I know that will decrease your FPS. In terms of accuracy, I don't know. I hear very mixed things about it, and I'm not going to try it myself. I'm perfectly happy with the tight bore systems I use. But if you are shooting too hot, you can get a shorter barrel. And just make sure it's really well centered and has spacers on it so you don't shoot BBs into the barrel, outer barrel. Another way to do it is with an end pass. Basically, if you want to look at it, an end pass, it's going to be a rough drawing of a nozzle. Here's your nozzle. And then here's like the rest of the nozzle. Crude drawing. This is where the air comes out to push your BB. And then usually you have right here where it mates up with the magazine feed lips, like right here. That's where the air comes in. This is where the air comes in. And then you have what they usually call like a jet valve, or I don't even know what else people call it. But they have like a jet valve, and then back here is your blowback unit, I guess you can call it, right here. So what happens is air comes in, part of that air flows, pushes the BB out. Then some air comes back here, builds up, pushes this valve closed, so it seals. So then there's no more air coming out of here, and all the air is coming back here to the blowback unit. I can get into detail about how blowback units work. For now, I'm not going to. We're just going to be talking about FPS and stuff like that. So you have all this air coming back here. What an end pass does is they allow you to adjust forward and backward how far that valve is in the normal position. So if you think about it, if the valve is back here, more air comes out here, which bumps up your FPS. But at the same time, since you can't take from nothing and gain something, you have to gain and lose something. So since you have more air coming this way, you're gonna have less air to come back this way fast. So what happens is your recoil, how fast it cycles, actually goes down. So when I had an M14 DMR with an end pass in it, I don't really care about how much it cycled or how hard it cycled, because I'm not shooting fast. I just need that BB to be flying fast. But let's say you're indoors and you want to adjust your FPS so it's lower. What happens is your valve sits closer here. When it sits closer here, you have less air going to the BB, more air going to the blowback unit, which means your gun is going to cycle a little bit faster and a little bit harder. There are points with an end pass sometimes where you can adjust it where your BB shoots 10 FPS or doesn't even shoot out the barrel because it's so low, but kicks like a damn mule. For airsoft, it'll kick like a mule. On the other end of the spectrum, you can have it where you have your FPS is way too illegal, which I've done. I've had my M14 shoot like 600 with a .32. Maybe not that, it's been a while, but it was shooting really hot, like really, really hot. But there wasn't enough gas to cycle the blowback unit. So for the normal ranges of, I would say, US airsoft places, from indoors to outdoor DMR limits, a end pass will be fine running from both, let's say 350 with a .2 to 450 with a 2.5. It will run in that spectrum just fine. You'll see a slight increase or decrease with your snappiness and recoil, but not to the drastic measures where your gun's not going to cycle or your gun cycles too hard and beats itself to death. But this is pretty much how the end pass works. That's how you can adjust FPS without having to mess with your inner barrel. For FPS, I haven't tested this out fully. I'm not going to say it's true or I'm going to say it's false. Changing your buffer spring and your buffer or your bolt, like how stiff the spring is or how heavy the buffer is or how heavy the bolt is, like changing those weights or that stiffness of spring may have some effect on your FPS. I don't think it's too much to really have much concern over. Yeah, again, I haven't really tested it out. Maybe I will, but all that system with the buffer and the bolt moving, that shouldn't have too much effect on the actual amount of gas going down the barrel. I'm not going to disprove it. I might try to see and work out the evidence in the future. If there is any FPS change, I haven't personally seen enough FPS change messing with the spring or the weight where it had much of an effect on the FPS where it really had cause for concern. I'm not going to give an exact number, but if there was any change, it was probably negligible, so probably maybe around 5 to at most 20 FPS difference. For me, I usually run outdoors, and for the FPSs I usually try to run the FPS just a little bit lower than what's the limit is, like a lot lower than what AEGs usually do for the limit, or HPA, because GBBRs do tend to fluctuate with FPS a lot differently, especially with how hot it is, if you left the mags out in the sun. So I like to give myself a little wiggle room. My GHK that shoots for outdoors, it shoots like maybe 360, 370 with a .25, so I have a very comfortable wiggle room in case my mags do heat up too much or whatever. But that can have somewhat of an effect, so just keep an eye on that if you're doing some drastic changes to your buffer or your bolt or your buffer spring. Just keep that in mind. Also, I forgot to mention, when you're talking with buffer rates, let's say you want to put a weaker buffer in, you don't necessarily have to buy a whole new buffer. What you can do is cut a coil or a couple coils off of the assembly, so it takes less to compress it. Because I know finding different buffers and springs for GBBRs can be a little bit harder compared to pistols. So if you do want a lighter spring, you can always cut coils. For stiffer, it's really hard. I know Viper Tech is some of the stiffest buffer springs you can get. A lot of people buy Viper Tech buffer springs for their ARs, like WE, GHK, GMP. They buy those because they're pretty heavy. I can say for sure GMP buffer springs are heavier than GHK. I know it's kind of easy to find light buffer springs for like winter use, but heavier is a little harder to find. But yeah, if there's any questions, if there's anything you really want me to go into super big details about, I'll think about it. Depends on the subject or what specifically you want me to go into really big detail with. But yeah, if you have any questions about tuning gas blowback rifles or whatever, let me know. This is pretty much just the basics on how to tune your gas blowback rifles. There's lots of brands and different gas systems and different variables that go into tuning a gas blowback rifle. So sorry if this didn't hit exactly what you're looking for, but hopefully this gave you some sort of sense on where to begin with tuning your gas blowback rifle.